Great. It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the FeBo team, that is Claudio Biaggetti, Roy Van Wyk, Sebastian Scharf, Rebecca Massinelli here in the room, and me, to welcome you to our 12th FeBinar. The webinars organized as part of our ERC project. FeBinars are our think tank. It is through them, with the support of specialists and individual topics, that we carry on the thinking on the most debated issues of our project. The main goal of FeBo is to investigate the complexity of the dynamics affecting the internal and the external border areas of Greek federal states. Our focus is on a big question. How can border wars be avoided, and how can federalization processes contribute to ease? As a consequence, we need to work on hot topics in the current debate, such as the evolution of border, their linearity and porosity. Both should be studied in an historical perspective, of course. The capacity of COINA to implement border management policies, as well as the development of border management cultures bottom-up, both in a regional as well as in a pan-Hellenic perspective, and then the relevance of cross-border activities and balances of power. Since intra-federal and external borders must necessarily be approached from various and different research perspectives and with different questions, FeBo organizes two distinct series of FeBinars, of lectures, each with another focus, one on the internal borders, the management of internal borders by federal states, the other on external borders, crossing federal borders, ancient and modern. That's the title of this second webinar series. Both series have been initiated by the inaugural lecture by Hans Beck on March the 7th, which focused on a case studies involving both internal and external borders, the Masi Plain between Attica and Boeotia. Past speakers include Claudia Antonetti, Corinne Bonnet, Kaya Harter-Uibupu, Sibelle Breton, Francesco Palermo, Peter Funke, Alex Macaulay, Hans-Joachim Gerke, Nikolaos Petrochilos, Federica Pezzoli, and Clémence Weber-Palais. In the framework of our ERC project, this is the fifth one of the FeBinar series Crossing Federal Borders, Ancient and Modern, focusing on external border areas of ancient Greek federal states. This series aims to analyze how COINA dealt with the problem of external, that is, extra-federal borders and border areas. Did border management policies aim at peaceful coexistence? To what extent were balance of power and stability an objective? This and other questions we are asking presuppose other thorny issues. What borders are we talking about? The borders of polis, of districts, between districts? What are the internal borders of federal states? What was the relationship of the federal states to the territory? How did they organize it? What was the relationship between territory and membership? And to what extent could the latter become more significant than territoriality? And how the relationship between confederation and sub-confederation is configured both politically and administratively, legally, territorially. In this regard, the Arcadians represents a fascinating yet challenging and puzzling case study. As it is well known, the Arcadian Confederacy was created in the 70s of the 4th century and in 363 split up into two groups, at least one of which continued to act as a confederacy until the Battle of Mantinea in 362. During its brief existence, questions about frontiers took several forms: the foundation of megalopolis, the inclusion of non-Arcadian communities had an enormous impact on internal and external frontiers and on the way they are intertwined with the ongoing restructuring of federal arrangements. We look forward to hearing from our guest, James Roy, who needs no introduction, of course, but I'll just say a few words for the younger ones. James Roy is Emeritus Professor at the Department of Classics and Archaeology of the University of Nottingham, as well as member of the Center for Spartan and Peloponnesian Studies, the most important center on these topics. He has been Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the Seminar für Alte Geschichte und Epigraphik, Ruprecht-Karl-Universität Heidelberg. And I could go on for hours listing the important moments of his academic career. I will just summarize them by saying that he established himself as the foremost expert in Arcadian studies, a reference point for later generations who still refer to him. As an expert on Arcadia, he also became interested in and explored topics such as the Eleans and the many regional ethnic communities of the Western Peloponnese. More generally, he also deals with Greek social and institutional history and the Greek countryside. Among his recent publications, let me cite the paper Arcadia and Eleia as Contrasting Examples of Numismatic Habit in Grandjean's books The Koina of Southern Greece, and then The Dynamics of the Arcadian Ethnos or Polis versus Koinon in Hans Becker, Kostas Bourakelis, and Alex Macaulay's Ethnos and Koinon, Studies in Ancient Greek Ethnicity and Federalism, and then a paper published in 2016 on adapting Arcadian ancestors in Arcadien im Altertum, edited by Klaus Tausend. Memorials of War in Pausanias, in the book which published the proceedings of the conference held here in Trento in 2016, if I correctly remember. And then the chapter on Elis with Acroria and Pisatis in the new Larsen, Hans Beck and Peter Funke's Federalism in Greek Antiquity, published for Cambridge University Press 2015, yes. So we are really very honored to have him here with us. And I would also like to mention that Professor Jim Roy is a friend of Trento. He was here in 2015 at the Commemorating War and War Dead conference I organized together with Giorgia Proietti. And in 2021 in autumn at the Humboldt Colleague dedicated to federalism, neighborhood in ancient Greek federal Greece, where we enjoyed his talk on the Arcadians, on Elis and Arcadia, which are also his topic today. So it's really time now to leave him the floor. I should confess I fell in love with the title of his talk, Changing Frontiers in and Around Arcadia, the work of the Arcadian Federation in the 60s. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. And thank you both for inviting me to take part in this series of talks, and also for the very generous introduction that you have just given. As you said, there was no federal structure in Arcadia before the early 360s or perhaps 370. In the 5th century, there was an extensive coinage with the legend Arcadicon, and we don't have a clear explanation for that yet. It used to be thought that it was a federal coinage, but I think that that idea has been abandoned, and I think generally people accept that there's no evidence of federation in Arcadia before the Battle of Leuctra in 371. As is well known, at Leuctra, the Thebans and their allies inflicted a heavy defeat on the Spartans, and that defeat, in effect, ended Spartan domination of Peloponnesian politics. But the effects weren't immediately apparent. In fact, later that year, after the battle, the Spartans sent another army north. It didn't achieve much, but it's notable that it was accompanied by allied troops from both Tegea and Mantinea in Arcadia. That's interesting because they are the two cities which Xenophon singles out in his Hellenica as the origins of Arcadian federalism. It took time, evidently, for the reaction to Leuctra to make itself felt. And it made itself felt in different ways in the two cities. Mantinea had been destroyed by the Spartans in 385. The town was destroyed, the Mantineans were divided into 4 or 5 separate little communities. But now they came together again, rebuilt their town, rebuilt their city wall, and created once more the polis Mantinea. All this apparently was done peacefully. There must have been some Mantineans who still favored Sparta, but we don't hear of any major opposition. In Tegea, things were very different. There was violent conflict between pro-Spartan Tegeans and anti-Spartan Tegeans. And many of the pro-Spartans were killed, and according to Xenophon, about 800 fled to Sparta as exiles. Tegea was left in control of anti-Spartan federalists because they were very much in favor of creating an Arcadian confederacy. According to Xenophon, it's from these 2 towns that the confederacy emerged. He says nothing about the views of other polis, apart from 2, Heraia and Orchomenos, Heraia in the west, Orchomenos in the east. These 2 opposed the confederacy. And not only did that, but actually helped the Spartans in military activity in Arcadia. And so it's not surprising that other Arcadians used military force to end their opposition. They did, in fact, join the confederacy in due course, and they appear on a list of federal magistrates. We don't know what went on in other states. Presumably, not everyone was enthusiastic about confederacy, and it has to be said that what was proposed could endanger the interests of individual members of the confederacy. According to Xenophon, according to Xenophon, the pro-federalist in Tegea proposed that in the new confederacy, the koinon, what was decided by the confederacy should be binding on all the polis. And it's quite clear from the foundation of Megalopolis that the confederacy forced member states to join Megalopolis. The confederacy clearly was a threat to some extent to the independence of polis, but nonetheless, it came into being apparently quite quickly in 370, 369, 371, 370. The general background in Arcadia, well, I beg your pardon, the geography of Arcadia is important. Arcadia was not isolated, despite what is sometimes said in modern studies. There were routes from Arcadia to all the neighboring areas of the Peloponnese, and the Arcadians could interact without difficulty with their neighbors and indeed with states beyond, like Athens and Thebes. But the nature of the interaction, to some extent, was affected by geography. When it came to any extension of Arcadia, any incorporation of territories into the new confederacy, that was unlikely to happen in the north, where there were mountains between Arcadia and Achaia. There were roads across the mountains, but the mountains offered a rough boundary. And likewise to the east, between Arcadia and the Argolid and the Syriatis, again, there were mountains that roughly marked the division between the 2 areas. There might have been a slight Arcadian extension towards the Syriatis eastwards. A fragment of Theopompus suggests that Eua was a polis of Arcadia, and it seems to refer to the 4th century. But the inscriptions from Argos, which the Greek epigraphist Tritsas is working on, and about which he has published preliminary findings, suggest that Eua, the place mentioned by Theopompus, was taken by Argos probably following the Battle of Leuctra. So the slight evidence for expansion eastwards is very doubtful. It is also the case that there were easy routes from Arkadia southwest to Messenia. But once Messenia had been liberated from Spartan control in winter 370-369, through the 360s, it was friendly to Megalopolis. So while there was interaction, there was no question of extending Arkadia towards Messenia. In later years, through the Hellenistic period, there were problems about territorial boundaries there, but not in the 360s. I will come later to the war that broke out in 365 between Arkadia and its western neighbor, Elis. The war led to the Arcadians occupying Olympia, which had, of course, been controlled by Elis. And that in turn led to the Arcadians taking money from Olympia to pay for the needs of the Confederacy. One need was to pay the standing army that the Confederacy maintained, the eparitoi. And another cost was the public buildings at Megalopolis, which went on for some decades, in fact. When the Confederacy was started, in its early years, it would have had money because the great invasion of first Laconia and then Messenia in winter 370-369 will have provided a great deal of booty. But gradually, as the years went on, the costs went on, the wars went on, the Arcadians found it more difficult to fund what they were doing. And they began to take money from Olympia, particularly to pay the eparitoi. Some Arcadians, especially Mantineans, by about 363 were objecting to this policy. They said it was impious. The Arcadians should not take money from the sanctuary of Zeus. The result was a disagreement that split the Confederacy. The majority of Arcadians agreed with Mantinea, and they moved off, resumed their relations with Sparta, and made an alliance with Sparta and Athens. Tegea and the new Megalopolis, on the other hand, maintained their alliance with Thebes. And the result was that there were Arcadians on both sides at the Battle of Mantinea in 362. The Confederacy clearly was fatally split. It's not very clear what was left of the Confederacy, or possibly two confederacies from the two groups that disagreed. Some semblance of a confederacy was certainly maintained. For instance, to take only one piece of evidence, we know from Demosthenes and from Aeschines himself that the Athenian orator and politician Aeschines spoke before the Murioi in Megalopolis in the year 348-347. The Murioi were the federal citizen assembly of the Arcadian Confederacy. So Megalopolis was clearly keeping up some of the forms, at least, of confederacy. That's only one example, and there are others, but we really have very little evidence of Confederate activity after 363. So today, I'll confine my remarks essentially to the years from 370 to 363. the Confederacy was clearly based on Arcadian ethnic identity. There were different pieces of evidence for this. One very striking one is the great monument which still stands in the sanctuary at Delphi, and which was set up by the Arcadians, possibly by Tegea, in fact, after the great invasion of Laconia and then Messenia by the Arcadians and their allies in Boeotia and in the Peloponnese, Elis and Argos. The campaign was very much an allied effort. And in fact, the campaign was led by the Theban commander Epaminondas. But the monument at Delphi, which sets up a monument celebrating, as the Arcadians put it, laying waste to Lacedaemon, mentions only the Arcadians. There's no mention of all the others who fought in this campaign. And the Arcadians, in the verses that are inscribed on the base of the monument, call themselves the autochthonous people, autochthon Laos, from holy Arcadia, Iaras ab Arcadias. It's a very Arcadian monument. And this feeling of strong Arcadian identity was also shown, apparently, in speeches which an Arcadian politician called Lycomedes, a Mantinean, was making in Arcadia at the same time. So given the clear importance of Arcadian ethnic identity, two questions arise. Firstly, were all Arcadians expected to join the new confederacy? And secondly, was it clear exactly which communities were Arcadian and which were not? Or in other terms, were the frontiers of Arcadianism clear? And were non-Arcadians allowed to join the confederacy? The answer to the first question, whether all Arcadians were expected to take part, is apparently that they were, though this is never clearly set out. The only clear evidence we have is that two and only two communities, Orchomenos in the east and Charaia in the west, opposed the federation. And not only that, they sided with the Spartans in military activity. And so the Arcadians, other Arcadians, overcame them by military force and compelled them to join. They certainly did join in the event. But these are the only two Arcadian communities we hear of that raised any objection to joining the confederacy, and they were forced into it. Secondly, there were questions about the Arcadian identity of some communities that eventually joined the confederacy, and I'll come to those later. For the most part, they were small communities like Lasion up in the northwest. But the big addition, of course, was Triphylia, which I'll equally come to later. So when the confederacy was created in 370, it was apparently composed of a group of polis that believed themselves, strongly believed themselves to be Arcadian and were very proud of it. And its external boundaries were the external boundaries of the Arcadian communities that lay on the edge of Arcadia next to non-Arcadian neighbors. But the confederacy later had to take other decisions about where the boundaries should be. And so in what I'm going on to say, two themes will be treated, both involving the decisions about frontiers. One is the foundation of megalopolis with both internal and external frontiers. And the other is the expansion of the confederacy and the consequent extension of its external frontiers. And that will also involve consideration of areas which the Arcadians chose not to admit to the Confederacy. I apologize for the quality of the map. It's not perhaps very clear, but right at the center is Megalopolis. And my reason for showing it is that it marks routes leading to or from Megalopolis. The routes that are shown are actually those followed by Pausanias in the 2nd century AD, but he did follow most of the main routes into and out of Megalopolis. As you can see, there are many routes, and one that was extremely important is coming up from the southeast. Here, that is the route up the valley of the river Eurotas from Laconia to Megalopolis. And it's the easiest route for anyone like the Spartan army marching north or traveling north. It's a much easier route because the watershed between the Eurotas and the Arcadian rivers to the north is low. It's a much easier route than going through the hills directly north from Sparta to Tegea. And once the Spartans arrived in what became the Megalopolis basin, they could go in any direction. They could turn southwest and go down into Messenia. And it was easier for an army to reach Messenia from Sparta by using that route than by crossing Mount Taygetus. They could go west towards Tryphilia or Elis. They could go into Arcadia to the north, or they could go east past Tegea and on into the eastern Peloponnese and central Greece. Strategically, this was a very important area. And the foundation of Megalopolis was almost certainly intended to bring the area under one central body, the new polis, Megalopolis. It had been controlled by small groups, probably themselves small confederacies, but the control was divided among several groups. Now it was to be brought together. There was also clearly a display to impress the Greeks. The Arcadians were at last united, and they were building the great city, the Megalopolis. And it was a great city. The architecture was striking. The evidence, however, for the actual foundation of Megalopolis, the process by which the Confederacy brought Megalopolis into being, the actual evidence is bad, and Thomas Nielsen, in his book on the Arcadian polis in 2002, gives an excellent analysis of the difficulties, which he sets out clearly. The two main accounts of the foundation come from the writers Pausanias and Diodorus, and they disagree with each other. Diodorus mentions about 20 communities involved. Pausanias gives a list which is almost certainly of 40. There are 39 names in the manuscript and a lacuna where there would be a 40th. I used to believe that Pausanias was representing a Confederate decision to include these 40 communities in the new city, but that decision was not carried out completely. I've changed my mind, and I think that what Pausanias is representing in his account is what he was told at Megalopolis when he visited it in the 2nd century AD, in other words, about 500 years after Megalopolis had been founded. And so there was plenty of time for the information to be reshaped as interest changed over the years. But one feature that we find in the accounts of both Pausanias and Diodorus is that the inhabitants of the communities that were to be incorporated in Megalopolis were to leave their homes and go to the new city. That's impossible. It would have emptied the megalopolitan countryside, which was large, of its population, of the labor force that was needed to work the countryside. And it would have been madness to move everyone into the new city. But some people did move, because Diodorus reports trouble in the year 361, that's to say after the Battle of Mantinea, when some people who had moved to the new city wanted to go back to their homes. And this caused such tension that the Arcadians, it would be those Arcadians who still favored Boeotia, they appealed to Boeotia for help. And the Boeotians sent an army that restored order and allowed the foundation of the city to continue. It was quite a large army, 300 cavalry and 3,000 hoplites. It was clearly serious disturbance. What is clear is that numerous communities that were incorporated in Megalopolis continued as communities. What role they played within the city is not clear. They may have had a part in local administration, like the demes in Attica, but certainly they maintained their identity as communities, they maintained their territory, and they were sufficiently organized to be able to separate out sometimes and return to the status of independent polis. To take only one example, we know that the cities that are listed on your screen in the 2nd century BC minted coins under the Achaean League. So they were members of the Achaean League. They were once more polis with their own constitution, their own territory. And after a couple of centuries in Megalopolis, they had still retained sufficient structure and identity to operate once more as polis when they were given the chance. So Megalopolis was made up of a number of communities which were reasonably well organized. And one thing that is clear is that these communities maintained their own territories. Within Megalopolis, the territories had only a local significance. They were internal frontiers. And when Pausanias writes about Arkadia, which he visited, as I said, 500 years later, he doesn't mention the actual frontiers of these territories, but he does mention the territories. And quite remarkably, in some cases where the central point of the territory had disappeared, where the town no longer existed, Pausanias still mentions the territory, which was obviously still remembered. There's an example on the screen. The polis Trapezus was in ruins. It was no longer functioning as a town, but its territory, Trapezontia, was still identifiable within the territory of Megalopolis. So the internal frontiers of Megalopolis continued to play some role, at least locally, for centuries. When Megalopolis was set up, there could conceivably have been questions about these internal territories, but we have only one piece of evidence that survives by chance. It was an inscription which was set up at Orchomenos in eastern Arcadia, and which recorded a decision by the Arcadians, that is the term used, about a frontier that ran from a point where the frontiers of 3 communities, Orchomenos, Tosunion, and Mesidrion, met. Mesidrion, we know, had been dominated by Orchomenos, and it looks as though the Arcadians were establishing the frontier which would now separate Mesidrion from Orchomenos. And it's therefore been supposed, and I think rightly, that Mesidrion was going to be taken into Megalopolis, and Orchomenos, of course, was not. It's possible even that Orchomenos was being punished for its earlier opposition to the Confederacy by losing Misydrion, because Misydrion, which is up into the northeast of Megalopolitan territory, certainly wasn't needed for the defensive purposes of Megalopolis. The other megalopolitan frontier that needs consideration lay to the south. Beyond it was Laconia. It's well known that through the Hellenistic period, there were disputes between Sparta and Megalopolis about territory. They continued. There were even wars. But it does look as if when Megalopolis was founded, the Confederacy decided to incorporate in it territory that had been taken from Laconia in the war, the invasion of 370, 369. Pausanias does include territory in that area in his list of communities to be incorporated, but that list, as I say, is problematic. It does, however, look as if there was territory taken, and that would mean that Perioecic territory from northern Laconia became not only part of Megalopolis, but it became Arcadian. The frontier of Arcadia was pushed south. It wouldn't be altogether surprising because Xenophon in his Hellenica in Book 6, referring to 370, says that a number of Perioikoi were very willing to defect from Sparta. And the obvious alternative would be to join Arcadia. So it looks as though when Megalopolis was founded, the Confederacy incorporated former Perioecic territory from Laconia, and so extended the frontier not only of Megalopolis, but of Arcadia itself, at least a little way south. This brings us to the question of external frontiers. And certainly the big change in the external frontier was the incorporation of Triphylia. But before I come to that, I'd like to mention the case of Lasion. Lasion was a very small place up here. It had, in the 5th century, been a subordinate ally of Elis. And it lay not far from communities that were certainly Arcadian, like Heraia, Selpusa, Sophies, and so on. West of Lasion was an area known as Acrorea, a hilly area. Lasion was small, but it had a fortified acropolis. It has been identified and explored, though not excavated. And it had a certain military importance for movement in its own area. Elis, from the 6th century onwards, had established domination over its neighbors in the western Peloponnese. North of the Alpheus, some territory was actually incorporated into Polis Elis directly. Other areas became subordinate allies. South of the river Alpheus, there were more subordinate allies. Then, after the Peloponnesian War, there was a war between Sparta and Elis. Sparta won and forced Elis to give up all its subordinate allies. And among those that Elis lost, in Xenophon's account, were the Acroreans, west of Lasion, and Lasion, which was being claimed by Arcadians. That's a known phrase, and various attempts have been made to understand what this claim was. And this fact that a claim was being made suggests that a counterclaim was possible, or that other people were claiming something else. So why were Arcadians claiming Lasion? There was at the time no pan-Arcadian structure that Lasion could join. So the claim was not that Lasion should be incorporated in some sort of Arcadian federation. There was none. The claim was certainly not to counter any attempt by Elis to hold on to Lasion, because Acrorea was between Elis and Lasion, and if the Eleans lost Acrorea, they had no way of maintaining control of Lasion. So that's not a possibility. And the way Xenophon words this does not suggest that some particular Arcadian polis was trying to incorporate Lasion in its own territory. The Greek would be very strange if that's what was happening. The only interpretation I can see that may be possible was that Acrorea, which does seem to have been itself a small confederacy, might have incorporated Lasion. And some Arcadians, presumably neighbors in the northwest, did not want that to happen. I can't make sense of the text in any other way. But it does mean that there was doubt about the ethnic identity of Lasion. It could be seen as Arcadian, but presumably it could be seen as non-Arcadian. And the frontier of Arcadia could include it or not. In fact, it did. Lasion became Arcadian. It's notable that as Xenophon talks about Lasion, which he does a few times in here and in later years, yeah. Oh, sorry, I've got lost in my own PowerPoint. When Xenophon mentions the Lasion in years to come, he always associates it with Elis. He, obviously, in that particular passage, then he lists the forces that took part in the battle at the river Nemea in 394, and among them, fighting alongside the Spartans, were nearly 3,000 of Eleans and Drifilians and Acroreans and Lasionians. Bizarrely, Xenophon lists alongside Elis former allies of which Elis had lost control, Trifilia, Acrorea, and Lasion. But he lists Lasion with the others. He doesn't mention Lasion alongside the Arcadian troops who fought in that battle with Sparta. Then, when he eventually, going forward to 365, reports that Elis did move, Elis had evidently recovered Acrorea and could move on Lasion and did recapture it in 365. Xenophon tells us of the incident and says that Lasion was previously theirs, had previously belonged to the Eleans, but at present was part of the Arcadicon, the Arcadian confederacy that existed in the 360s. So again, there's a mention of the Ilium. Xenophon never explicitly denies Lasion's Arcadian identity, but every time he mentions it, there is a connection to Elis. At any rate, the case of Lasion shows that the ethnic identity of a community on the borders of Arcadia was not necessarily clear, and to some extent could be manipulated to suit whatever purposes people had. But Lasion was small, and Tryphilia was much bigger, and I'll move on to that. The area between the Alpheus and the Neda in the 5th century was under Ilian domination, certainly by the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. The Ilian control went down to Lepreon, whose territory sat along the northern bank of the river Neda. There's a very good study of this area by Nielsen, first in an article in 1997, and then the main argument was repeated in his book in 2002. He argues that the communities in Tryphilia, and there were several, as you can see, had no common identity in the 5th century. But at the same time, he argues that there were some connections, partly mythical and partly others, between Tryphilia and Arcadia. The most evident of these connections concerns Phryxa, because the Athenian writer Arkadia in the 5th century declared that Phryxa was in Arcadia. But it's typical of the uncertainty about identities in the area that Herodotus lists polities that he believes were founded by the Minians. And in the list is again Phryxa. So you have a choice, either it was Arcadian or it was Minian in the 5th century. But after the war between Sparta and Elis, when Elis lost control of all its subordinate allies, those between the Alpheus and the Neda, now freed from Ilian control, were united in a confederacy. They became the Tryphilians. The name suggested that there was some idea of 3 phylae, 3 groups, but it's not at all clear what these would have been. Nonetheless, they all became Tryphilian. For the first time, the area had a single common identity. The Tryphilians certainly did not want to return to Ilian domination, and they were safe as long as Sparta held Messenia, the southern neighbor of Tryphilia. As long as the Spartans were in Messenia, Tryphilia was pretty safe from the Ilians. But then in winter 370-369 came the great invasion in which first Laconia was attacked, and then most of Messenia was liberated from Spartan control. Tryphilia found itself without Spartan support to protect it. Elis, clearly in the 360s, wanted to regain control of its allies, including Tryphilia. And it was in those circumstances that Tryphilia joined the Arcadian Confederacy. In the Hellenica, Xenophon tells us And the context are events of autumn 369. He tells us that the Eleans asked the Arcadians for the cities that had been taken from them by the Spartans. The Arcadians paid no attention to what the Eleans were saying, but set great store by the Tuphilians and the others who had revolted from the Eleans, because they said that they were Arcadian. Somehow the Tuphilians had become Arcadian, and the tone of Xenophon's comment suggests that this was their choice. They wanted to be Arcadian. It may have been a strategic choice. Being Arcadian would give them the protection of the Confederacy. They were no longer protected by Sparta. They were threatened by Elis. Becoming Arcadian would be attractive. It's not clear, incidentally, who the others who had revolted from Elis were. The ones that Xenophon mentions in that passage. But the Tuphilians evidently wanted to be Arcadian, and the Arcadian Confederacy accepted their desire. There must have been negotiations, there must have been a federal decision taken in Arcadia, but these are not reported in the surviving sources. Nonetheless, a great display was made of the Tuphilians now being Arcadian. I mentioned already the great monument that was set up at Delphi after the invasion of Laconia by the Arcadians, which commemorated the invasion and was very Arcadian in its tone. On the monument were statues representing Arcas, the ancestor of the Arcadians, and the sons of Arcas. And among the sons of Arcas on the monument was Tryphilos. He's obviously the eponym of the Tuphilians. And the Arcadians were declaring to the Greek world, to everyone who visited Delphi, that the Tuphilians were now Arcadian. Tryphilos was a son of Arcas. When exactly the Tuphilians joined is not clear. When Xenophon tells us that in autumn 369, the Tuphilians were saying that they were Arcadian, that suggests that they were not yet members of the Confederacy, but they must have joined fairly soon afterwards for Tryphilos to be on the monument. The monument was very elaborate. The invasion it commemorated had taken place in winter 370-369. It would have taken some time to make all the statues and the other elements of the monument, but not a very long time. And by the time it was ready, the Tryphilians were clearly shown as Arcadian and members of the Confederacy. The Arcadians had evidently taken the decision to extend the Confederacy, to push their frontier out to include Arcadia, at the expense, of course, of antagonizing the Eleans, who badly wanted to recover Tryphilia. Elis and Arcadia had been allies since the period following Leuctra, but the alliance now broke down. The Arcadians had taken Tryphilia, the Achaeans wanted it, the Tryphilians didn't want to be Elean. In 365, open warfare broke out. The Eleans, who had somehow recovered Arkadia, moved through it and attacked Lasion and recaptured it. It seems a strange thing to do. It was a small city, obviously recapturing it was going to bring war with Arcadia. Why the aliens thought that it was worthwhile, we don't know, but they did. The Arcadians reacted vigorously. They retook Lacion, they penetrated into Elean territory where they occupied Acrorea, or most of Acrorea, and pushed on and took control of Pisatis, the district, including the great sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia. And so for a time, the Arcadians dominated a significant part of eastern Elean territory, including the great sanctuary. But these areas did not become Arcadian. It would have been very difficult to suggest that Olympia was Arcadian. Olympia was so well known, and it was so obvious that it had not been Arcadian, that the Arcadians would have found it very difficult to extend their frontier in that way and maintain the Arcadian nationality that was the basis of their confederacy. What was done was rather to form alliances. Sorry, that some of that system. Two inscriptions have been found at Olympia, and one records an alliance between Arcadia and, on the other hand, Pisa and Acrorea. And the second one includes an alliance of Pisa with Sicyon and Messenia. The Arcadians used alliances instead of extending their territory. And for Olympia, the Arcadians set up a puppet state called Pisa or Pisatis, which nominally controlled Olympia. So the Arcadians were not pretending that Olympia was Arcadian. They were not extending their frontiers in that direction. Technically, they were not even controlling Olympia, but I'll come back to that. Pisatis now ran Olympia. The Eleans reacted vigorously, and the Arcadians had to defend Olympia against them. The Eleans even launched an attack during the Olympic Games of 364, which were organized by Pisatis. One other thing the Arcadians did was, it seems, to develop myths involving Arcadia. There was myth for Tryphonus, son of Arcas, myths that had been adapted to show the new Arcadian Tryphilia. The myth for Olympia was different, and it survives only by chance in a medieval Byzantine etymological dictionary or lexicon, the Etymological Magnum, in which the writer says, "I do not accept those who say that the place is Olympia, was named from Olympia, daughter of Arcas, whom Pisos married." This is the only reference to such a myth, but it's hard to see on what other occasion a myth like this would have been interesting. It links Olympia with Arcadia. Olympia becomes a daughter of Arcas, and it links both with Pisatis, because Pisos marries this Arcadian Olympia. So by a freak in this medieval Byzantine text, we learn of a myth that seems to have been set up to bring together the elements that arose from the war between Elis and Arcadia. Nominally, Pisatis ran Olympia. Nobody could pretend that Olympia was Arcadian. But some Arcadians, if we trust Xenophon, spoke as if the Arcadians were in control of the sanctuary, as they undoubtedly were, in fact. They began to worry about it, particularly because, as I said before, the Confederacy was taking funds from Olympia. And those who opposed the idea began to say, as Xenophon reports, that there was no advantage in having control of the sanctuary of Zeus. Tu tegar hierutu dios proestanai. So Arcadians, according to Xenophon, were talking as if they did have control of Olympia, which in fact they did, though nominally it was in the hands of Pisatis. The protests, like those reported here by Xenophon, split the Confederacy, as I said before. And in the end, led to the Battle of Mantinea and the virtual termination of Confederacy in Arcadia, even if remnants remain. So Arcadia in Olympia, instead of extending its frontier and including Olympia, had tried a different policy of setting up a puppet state. And that policy failed. It's not entirely clear what happened to Pisatis. The Eleans certainly took control of Olympia again when the majority of the Arcadians made peace with Elis and ended the war. So there's a clear difference between the treatment of Trophilia, which was brought within the frontiers of the Arcadian Confederacy, and the treatment a few years later, not only of Olympia, but Acrorea. Acrorea is interesting because it was a small, relatively small area of no great importance, not at all famous like Olympia. And if the Arcadians had really wanted to extend their territory, it would, I think, have been quite possible to treat Acrorea as Arcadian. Acrorea was certainly dominated by the Arcadians and was formally allied to Arcadia. But the Arcadians didn't do that. For whatever reason, they decided not to extend their frontiers again. And this does seem to have been a series of federal choices, different choices. They could extend Megalopolis and take in a little of northern Laconia, and so extend Arcadia. They could take in Trophilia and extend Arcadia in a major way to the southwest. Or, and again, they chose this in a different way. They could deal with places like Olympia and Acrorea differently. There does not seem to be a desire on the part of the Confederacy to expand its territory indiscriminately. They expanded only when it seemed reasonable to do that. And reasonableness seemed to depend on whether a place could reasonably be considered Arcadian. We don't hear of any neighbors that wanted to be Arcadian other than Trophilia, and no neighbors were taken into the Confederacy. It seems that a judgment was made on whether they said that they were Arcadian. And there I will close. Thank you very much. Over to you, Eleanor, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Jim Roy, for this rich talk and for showing us how complex the issue of external frontiers is, not only with reference to the Arcadians, of course, but in this case, especially with reference to the Arcadians, and also how complex the relation between external frontiers and territoriality is, and the different policies the Arcadians applied to different regional groups surrounding them. So thank you very much. So floor is open to debate, questions both here in the room and online. We are not using a Zoom webinar anymore, so you can just raise your hand and ask your question even live, or you can write your question in the chat, I guess. Vero che possono scriverla nella chat? I saw that we have also experts in Arcadian studies who are following our meeting and who will be speakers in our next FeBinars. Maria Pretzler. Hi, Maria. She just raised her hand. So please, if you want to ask your question live.
Hello, hello, Jim, and thank you so much for a fantastic paper. I'm still trying to formulate my question in my head, but I mean, I was really intrigued that you mentioned the question about the eastern border of Arcadia, because that's really been puzzling me. And I think one thing that we might actually see here is, I mean, what criteria they might have in terms of extending these borders, or perhaps how little we know, I'm not quite sure. But I mean, my sense was always that actually the connection from particularly Tegea down to the sea is clearly very important economically and at times also politically. And nevertheless, I mean, there doesn't seem to be an effort to get at least some of that included in Arcadia. After Leuctra, when, I mean, I'm assuming if there is an opportunity at any point, that is it. And so I really wonder whether, I mean, economics clearly doesn't play a role at all in all of this. So is it really mainly about identity, and possibly even about really people asking to be Arcadian, that makes people different? I guess what I'm trying to say is I'd just like to see whether there's more you'd like to say about the eastern border particularly.
Well, the one consideration, of course, is that to the east, Argos seems to remain a faithful ally of the anti-Spartan Arcadians. And so going east was difficult. Syriatus, of course, for a long time had been disputed between Argos and Sparta, and intervening there would have been difficult. It's hard to know what Pherecydes meant, and if the reference there is not to the 4th century, then where was it? That's just a puzzle, and I've got no answer to that. On your wider question, it is true that access to the sea would be important, but I think that there were trade routes into Arcadia, and so whether Arcadia actually controlled the port from which the route started, the goods came into Arcadia anyway, in different directions. And you're quite right that the route for Tegea would be from the east coast, past Eua into Tegean territory. I don't think that the Arcadians needed actually to control these routes in order for the trade to pass. But I can't offer you any evidence. I can only offer you lack of evidence, which maybe supports my case. I don't know whether all that helps.
No,
the other
thank
thing
you.
I would say is that there are roads across the mountain. There's a fairly spectacular rock cutting that allow the wagon, which Janis Pikolas has made well known in his book, that allowed the wagon road from the Arkadia to cross into the northeastern territory of Mountainair. So there were roads across the mountains, but there aren't communities whose identity is in doubt. You're either on the Arcadian side of the mountain or the Argyll side. So the mountain, or the serious mountains, does provide more or less a visible border between the two. Sorry, you were going to say something else, perhaps.
No, I mean, I think it's just, given in the context of this seminar particularly, I mean, I think it is actually interesting that there seems to be a fairly good indication that economic links have very little to do with how these boundaries are drawn. I often have discussions with my students who always immediately kind of assume that, for example, access to the sea is a very important aspect of drawing boundaries. But, in this case, I don't think it is. And I think, you've said the same thing. And I feel that's perhaps a really interesting example if we think about the nature of borders, actually.
Yes, there was certainly trade in and out of Arcadia. I mean, we can see some of it in the archaeological record. We can see pottery on Arcadian sites. It certainly came from Laconia or Corinth or Athens, wherever. And these things reached Arcadia. Arcadia needed salt. It didn't have salt. The salt came. Arcadia needed metals. It didn't have deposits of metal up to any significant extent. Metal came to Arcadia. There was trade, and the trade in must have been matched by trade out. So trade was going on quite a significant scale. But you're right, they don't seem to be calculating strategically in terms of controlling trade routes, certainly not in the 360s.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions or remarks online or in the room here? Well, then I take advantage of my position and ask a question to Professor Roy. Would you say that the shifting of external borders is connected or maybe even deeply connected to the potential for ethnic switching of border communities surrounding Arcadia?
Yes, I would. Thomas Nielsen has done a good job in trying to put together evidence that in Triphylia, already in the 5th century, there was some sense that they had connections with Arcadia. There's the clear statement by Pherecydes, though that is directly contradicted by Herodotus. There are other more indirect statements about mythical genealogies, and these are difficult arguments because the evidence is largely recorded in the work of Pseudo-Apollodorus. And the question then is how far back you can trace that material and whether you can suppose it already had the form that Apollodorus gives us in the 5th century BC, and I'm rather doubtful about that. So there are some Arcadian connections there. I'm not suggesting that Thomas Nielsen is completely wrong, but they are rather weak. In the 4th century, the Triphylians say that they are Arcadian. That's what Xenophon tells us. So there has been a shift. And the shifting of the federal frontier, or the frontiers of federal Arcadia, does seem to be related to whether communities could be considered Arcadian or did themselves consider themselves to be Arcadian. There's discrimination. There's not an attempt simply to expand Arcadia, which the Arcadians might have succeeded in doing. They were militarily quite strong. So, yes, I think is to summarize is my answer to your question. I think that
Thank you.
and I think too, it might be worth arguing that ethnic identities were not necessarily clear-cut and permanent. The Lasion in the 4th century clearly came to be regarded as Arcadian. When it was dominated by Elis as a subordinate ally in the 5th century, I very much doubt that anyone regarded it as Arcadian. And we've no evidence that the Lasionians themselves saw themselves as Arcadian. Ethnic identities were not fixed rigidly, especially on the frontiers. And they could change with time. And they may sometimes have changed because it was politically convenient. Undoubtedly, it suited the Tuphilians to have the protection of the Arcadian Confederacy against the Ilian desire to regain control of that part of what had been their allied structure. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much. Any other questions or remarks? Maybe one more quick question by me. It's a more general question. Do we have evidence on not a natural border, but something like Horoi, for example, in Arcadia, for internal borders of communities mentioned by the sources or even in the material culture?
It is certainly mentioned by the sources.
Okay.
There's a good article by Sylvain Bachar. I'm sorry, it's in a collected volume. I think the Festschrift for John Cherry, but I'm not sure. There's an article about borders in Pausanias, and he shows that Pausanias' treatment of borders and markers of borders, this is borders rather than territories within borders. Pausanias' treatment of borders in Arcadia is particularly rich. He goes so far as to suggest that by the time he came to borders in Arcadia, Pausanias had mastered the treatment of borders and frontiers and could set out where the frontiers were. There were markers on certain routes, according to Pausanias, routes to Laconia, routes to Messenia. There were markers or religious shrines that indicated the frontier. I don't offhand recollect internal within Arcadia, internal markers of frontiers, though Pausanias mentioned that there were such things. I don't recollect any that actually survived. And as I said, the only indication that there was a need to determine a frontier when Megalopolis was founded is the inscription that seems to refer to the frontier from a point where Tosunion, a polis about which we know very little indeed, Tosunion, Arkomenos, and Metirion met. There were also cases, there was one on the frontier between Mantinea and Arkomenos, where a religious sanctuary was on the frontier and was regarded as shared between the two communities. So the answer is yes, even if actual markers, so far as I recall, don't survive in the archaeological record. There were clear markers of frontiers within Arcadia, as well as of external frontiers. What Fashab doesn't mention, of course, is that there were a lot of polis in Arcadia. Even in Pausanias' time, though many polis had faded away, there were still 17 separate Arcadian polis, which would give rise to quite a lot of frontiers, so that Pausanias would have more occasion in Arcadia than in Elis, say, to observe frontiers as he traveled around. And it's therefore perhaps not surprising that he has much to say about internal frontiers and their markers in Arcadia. That's all that comes to mind, I think, on that question, for which I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Leonardo Cilleri,
yeah,
prego.
I have seen on the map that there is written Coile Elis, the hollow Elis. Elis has the same Indo-European root of valleys, valley. Did they forgot the true meaning of the true meaning of the word Elis? Did they join Coile because of this? Because Elis, the gamma went away. It has the same Indo-European root as Latin valleys. I don't know whether I'm understandable.
Yes, perfectly. Thank you. You're quite right. I mean, that is the generally accepted etymology of the name Elis. The Eleans were the people of the valley of the river Ladon, and the Acroreans, they are the people of the Acra, the highland to the east. But once the Eleans embarked on a policy of expansion, we don't know when exactly it began, but it was certainly well underway by the 6th century. That took the polis Elis either through its own territory as it grew, or through the alliances that it formed with other communities. That took the polis Elis out into a much wider area, well beyond the valley of the Ladon. And I don't suppose that they forgot what their name meant, but they certainly extended Elis well beyond the valleys, the valley where it had originated. But any expansion would have done that. The geography of the area, if you want to push your frontiers out, the geography of the area will take you away from that one river valley into other areas, whether the highlands that in Arkadia or the flatland, the fertile flatland that must have provided much of Elis. So, yes, I don't think they forgot what the name meant, but Elis grew far beyond that original limited area.
Thank you very much again, Professor Roy. So if there are no other questions or remarks, I want to express my gratitude really to Professor Roy for his wonderful talk, and also to all those attending both in the room and online. Oh, maybe Maria, you raise your hand again. No, okay. Okay, just to clap your hand. Thank you. Thank you again to all of you, and let me remind you our next webinar, which will take place On May 22nd, Chiara Lasagni with a paper on the Italians and their tele, one of the favorite subjects of FeBo. We have already benefited from the expertise of Professor Funke and Professor Claudia Antonetti on these topics. So thank you again and bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.